The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and by Friday, Eliza Mercer's father had already spent the money. She found out the way she found out most things that happened to her, not by being told, but by walking into a room she wasn't supposed to enter. Her father was sitting at the kitchen table with a man she didn't recognize, a lawyer from the look of his coat, and between them lay papers with her name, written at the top in ink so dark it looked permanent. "What is this?" she asked. Her father didn't even turn around. "Go back to your room, Eliza. That's my name on that paper." The lawyer shifted in his seat. He had the decency, at least, to look uncomfortable. Her father finally turned. He had the face of a man who had already made his peace with something and resented being asked to explain it. "You're 18, he said. "It's time you were useful." She read the document herself, every word of it. She stood there in the doorway of that Georgia kitchen with the smell of pine sap coming through the window and read that she was to be married to a man named Calder Boone of Billings County, Montana, a widowed rancher, 36 years of age, in need of a wife and housekeeper, and that in exchange for this arrangement, the sum of $400 would be delivered to Thomas Mercer upon receipt of the signed agreement. $400. That was what she was worth. That was what her father had decided. She looked up from the paper. Her father was watching her, with something that might have been guilt if he'd been a different kind of man. "Traded me," she said. "I settled a debt," he said. "There's a difference." There wasn't. She knew there wasn't. But there was nothing in that house worth fighting for, not the peeling wallpaper, not the broken porch step her father had promised to fix for 3 years, not the ghost of her mother who had died in the back bedroom when Eliza was 11 and left her alone with a man who was better at owing money than at raising a daughter. She signed the paper, not because she wanted to, because she understood at 18 that some doors only open in one direction. If you've ever had someone else make a decision about your life without asking if you've ever stood in a room and realized the people who were supposed to protect you had already sold the thing they were supposed to protect, then you know exactly what Eliza Mercer felt in that moment. This is her story, and it is one you will not forget. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now. Stories like this one don't wait, and neither should you. 3. Hit the like button if this is already pulling at something in your chest, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to Montana 1894 and to the frozen train platform where Eliza Mercer's new life was about to begin. Train pulled into Billings on the coldest morning of January, and Eliza stepped off the car into air so sharp it felt like the sky itself was trying to cut her open. She had never felt cold like that. Georgia winters were damp and gray and miserable in their own way, but they did not bite. Montana winter bit. It grabbed the back of her neck and squeezed, and she stood on the platform with her single battered suitcase and tried to remember how to breathe through her nose without it hurting. Round her, men in heavy coats moved with the certainty of people who knew exactly where they were going. Nobody looked at her. Nobody offered to help. The station master called out arrivals in a flat voice, and pigeons huddled on the roof beams, and Eliza stood very still because she had learned long ago that stillness was its own kind of armor. She was looking for a man named Calder Boone. She did not know what he looked like. Correspondence between them, 3 letters total, short and functional, had contained no physical description. It had written that he needed someone who could cook, keep a household, and manage a child. She had written that she could do all 3. Neither of them had written anything that resembled warmth. She had spent the train ride west, trying to construct a version of him in her mind. She kept arriving at her father, same age, same certainty, same eyes that looked at a woman and calculated her usefulness. She had tried to think of someone kinder and couldn't quite make it stick. Platform thinned out. Luggage was collected. Families reunited with the particular relief of people who had been apart too long. And Eliza stood there with her suitcase getting heavier by the minute and her feet already going numb inside her thin shoes. And she thought, what if he doesn't come? Gah, what if the letters were something else, something worse, and she had traveled 1,800 miles to stand on a platform in Montana and freeze to death? Then she heard boots on the wood planking. Heavy, deliberate, not hurried, but not slow either, the walk of a man who had decided where he was going and was going there. Taller than she expected. That was the first thing. Broad through the shoulders, dark-haired, with the kind of weathered face that had spent too many seasons outdoors and showed every one of them. He wore a coat that had been good once and wasn't anymore, and he held his hat in his hand like he'd been reminded by someone to take it off in the presence of a lady and was doing it out of habit rather than feeling. Looked at her once, quick like a man checking a fence line for damage. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Not a question, Mr. Boone," she said. There was a pause that lasted approximately 1 second longer than was comfortable. "Train was on time," he said. "Yes," she said. He reached for her suitcase. She let him take it, not because she needed him to carry it, but because refusing felt like the kind of battle she didn't have the energy for yet. Shn. He turned and walked back toward the edge of the platform, and she followed because there was nothing else to do. Then she saw the child. She was standing at the bottom of the platform steps, very small, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too big that made her look like she was wearing someone else's life. She had her father's dark hair and an expression that did not belong on a 6-year-old face, not exactly sadness, not exactly fear, but something harder than both. Something like resignation. Eliza stopped walking. Calder Boone looked back, noticed she'd stopped, looked at the child. "That's Mara," he said. His voice changed when he said it. "Not much, but enough that Eliza noticed. She doesn't speak," he added. "Hasn't, since her mother died. 2 years now." He said it the way you say something you've explained so many times it stopped hurting to say, but she could hear the place beneath the words where it still hurt anyway. Eliza looked at the little girl. The little girl looked back at her with eyes that were taking a very careful measurement of exactly how much trust this woman deserved. And the measurement was coming up short. "Hello, Mara," Eliza said. Mara said nothing. She blinked once slowly, like a cat deciding whether to leave the room. "All right," Eliza said softly. "You don't have to say anything." She meant it. She knew what it was to be in a situation you didn't choose, to have strangers expect things from you that you had no way to give. She did not smile too big, or crouch down, or do any of the things adults did when they wanted something from a child and were pretending they didn't. She just walked down the steps and stood beside Mara on the frozen ground and looked at the street ahead of them. After a moment, Mara moved, slightly closer. Just enough. Calder Boone watched this with an expression Eliza couldn't read, and then he turned away and walked toward the wagon, and she followed with the child walking in the small space between them. Drive out to the ranch took 2 hours on roads that were mostly frozen mud, and occasionally something worse. Calder drove. Eliza sat beside him on the wagon bench with Mara between them, the child pressed against her father's side, watching Eliza sideways the whole time like she expected her to do something surprising. Eliza watched the land instead. She had not understood before how big Montana was. Not in any real sense. She had looked at a map once and known the distances in a mathematical way, the way you know that the ocean is deep without having stood at the edge of it. But riding through the valley with the mountains rising white and enormous on every side, and the sky overhead so large it seemed to be pressing down, that was different. That was the kind of big that got into your chest and changed the shape of something. It was also, she would admit to no one, terrifying. She had grown up with Georgia's red clay roads and Georgia's close-packed trees, and the knowledge that there were people within walking distance if something went wrong. Here, the nearest anything seemed to be half a day's ride away, and the land didn't care about that. The land didn't care about anything. It was just there, cold and enormous and utterly indifferent. And Eliza Mercer sat on a wagon bench next to a man she didn't know, and understood for the first time that she was genuinely, completely alone. She did not let any of that show. She had learned that skill early. Calder spoke twice during the drive. Once to point out a landmark she'd need to know a split-trunk pine that marked the edge of his property, and once to say that supper would need to be made when they arrived because he hadn't had time that morning. Both statements were delivered in the same tone, flat and practical, and neither required a response beyond acknowledgement. She acknowledged both. She was trying to build a picture of him from small details, the way you piece together something in the dark by feel. Didn't talk much, he didn't waste movement. When the horse stumbled once on a rough patch of road, his hand moved to the reins with a speed and certainty that suggested he had been doing this particular thing for a very long time. Glanced at Mara occasionally, not hovering, not anxious, just checking, the way you check a fire you're responsible for. Did not look at Eliza that way. He did not look at her much at all. She told herself that was fine. That was actually better, probably. She had not come here expecting to be seen. Ranch house was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something rough but functional, a working man's home, worn at the edges but purposeful. What she found was a house that had clearly been well kept once, and then simply stopped being kept. Not out of laziness, she could tell that much immediately. Out of absence, out of the specific kind of neglect that happens when someone who cared about a place disappears from it and the person left behind doesn't know how to fill that shape. The front room was cold. The fireplace had ash in it that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. There were dishes on the table from at least 2 meals ago, and the floor had tracked in mud dried to a pale crust along the path from door to kitchen. Coat hung on a hook by the door that was too small to be Calder's and too old to be Mara's, and belonged, therefore, to someone who was no longer there. Eliza stood in the doorway and did not say anything about any of it. Calder set her suitcase down. He seemed to be waiting for something, a reaction maybe. Disgust or disappointment, or the particular way women sometimes looked at disaster and decided it was someone else's problem. She walked past him to the kitchen and started looking for wood. "Stack out back," he said from behind her. "I'll find it," she said. She did. Wood was half buried under a drift of snow, and her hands were already red and aching by the time she'd carried 3 armloads inside, and the fire took 4 tries to catch because the flue hadn't been opened properly. But it caught. She stood back from the fireplace with her coat still on and her cheeks burning from the cold-to-hot transition and watched the flames start to take hold. Mara had appeared in the doorway of the hallway, watching. Eliza looked at her. "Can you show me where the pots are?" Mara stared. Then, after a moment that stretched long enough that Eliza was ready to abandon the question, Thoughchild turned and walked into the kitchen. It wasn't language, but it was something. Supper was a rabbit stew she made from what she could find in the pantry root vegetables gone slightly soft. Dried herbs, a piece of salt pork, the rabbit itself, which had been hanging in the cold storage out back. It wasn't fine food. It was enough food, made from the same skills that had gotten a family of 2 through leaner years in Georgia, and when she set it on the table, she did not apologize for what it wasn't. Calder ate it without comment. Mara ate it carefully, watching Eliza over the rim of her bowl. After supper, Calder pushed back from the table and said, "I'll show you where you'll sleep." She had been braced for this. The whole journey she had been braced for this, the moment the arrangement became something other than what was written on paper. The moment a man with power over her situation decided to use it in a way she couldn't refuse. He led her down the short hallway to a door at the end, pushed it open. Inside was a small room with a single bed and a window that looked out over the snow-covered yard. There wasn't a latch on the door. She noted it immediately. "This was the guest room," he said. "I put clean sheets on this morning." She looked at the room. She looked at the latch. "I won't bother you," he said. His voice had gone flat and formal, like a man reading from a document. "That's not, I didn't bring you here for that. I need someone who can run this house and look after Mara. That's the arrangement I made, and that's what I intend to keep." He said it like he was expecting her not to believe him. She didn't. Quite. Not all the way. But she looked at the room with its clean sheets and its latching door, and she thought, a man who meant to harm her would not have put a latch on the inside. "All right," she said. "There's extra blankets in the chest," he said. "It gets cold." "I noticed," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was in the neighborhood of one. Then he turned and walked back down the hallway, and she was alone in the small room with the clean sheets and the latching door and the Montana dark pressing up against the window. She sat on the edge of the bed and put her face in her hands and let herself feel for exactly 60 seconds every single thing she had been holding back since the platform at Billings. Fear, the exhaustion, the particular grief of being traded by someone who was supposed to love you. Then she straightened up, took off her shoes, and lay down on the clean sheets in her clothes. She stared at the ceiling and made herself take stock. She was warm. She had eaten. The door latched from the inside. Those were 3 things. You could build on 3 things. Closed her eyes and listened to the wind hitting the window and thought about Mara's face when she'd shown her where the pots were, that tiny, grudging act of help, and somewhere in the middle of thinking about it, she fell asleep. She woke before dawn to the sound of boots in the hallway. Heavy, careful not trying to be quiet exactly, but not trying to wake her either. Calder, going out to the animals. She lay still and listened to the sound move through the house and out the back door, and then there was nothing but the wind and the distant lowing of cattle that needed tending. She lay there for another minute, maybe 2, counting the ceiling boards. Then she got up. If she was going to be here, and she was going to be here, there was no other option, and she'd made her peace with that. Then she was going to be here in a way that meant something. She was not going to be the kind of woman who waited to be told what to do and then did the minimum required to avoid punishment. She had watched her mother do that. She had watched her mother make herself smaller and smaller until she disappeared into the wallpaper. And she had sworn at 11 years old, standing at a grave in Georgia red clay, that she would never do the same. Kitchen was cold again. She rebuilt the fire, the same way as the night before. And while it caught, she found flour and fat and made biscuits from memory, rolling them on the table with a glass because there was no rolling pin. She found coffee beans and ground them by hand and set the pot over the fire. She found a ham bone in the cold storage and put it on to boil for something better at midday. Mara appeared in the kitchen doorway again, just as she had the night before. Same spot, same cautious assessment. Morning, Eliza said. She didn't stop what she was doing. You want to help or just watch? The long pause. Then Mara came into the kitchen and stood at the table, close enough to see but not close enough to commit to anything. "You can stir," Eliza said and handed her a spoon. Took it. She stirred. She stirred with the focused intensity of someone doing a job that mattered. Brow furrowed, taking it very seriously. And Eliza watched her from the corner of her eye and felt something loosen in her chest just slightly. Calder came back in while the biscuits were still in the oven. He came in from the cold with snow on his coat and his hands red and stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the fire and the coffee and the child stirring something at the table. And his face went through something Eliza couldn't quite catch before he settled it back into neutral. "Coffee's ready," she said. He poured himself a cup without comment, sat at the table. He watched Mara stir, and he drank his coffee in silence. And Eliza moved around the kitchen getting breakfast onto the table. It was the most ordinary thing imaginable, and also somehow the strangest morning of her life. She had been there 3 days when she found the quilt. She was cleaning properly this time, with intention, the way the house clearly hadn't been cleaned since sometime before the last winter. She'd worked her way through the front room and the kitchen and was starting on the back bedroom that Calder used, which he'd left the door open on, so she understood she was meant to clean it too. The room was austere in a way that felt deliberate. Bed, made with military precision each morning, she'd noted. Chest of drawers. A single chair. No ornamentation. Nothing personal. Nothing that would tell you anything about the man who slept there except for one thing. Bottom of the chest, folded carefully beneath a worn blanket, was a quilt. She almost didn't pull it out. It felt private in a way she didn't have words for. But the blanket on top needed shaking out, and when she moved it, the quilt came partially with it, and she caught it before it hit the floor and unfolded the corner instinctively. Workmanship was extraordinary. Even with the damage, and there was damage, 2 large sections coming apart at the seams, batting showing through in places. One corner stained dark in a way that might have been water, and might have been something else she could see what it had been. Pattern was a double wedding ring, flowers and arcs interlocking in shades of blue and cream, and a soft rose that had faded to something almost gray. A woman had made this. A woman who had known what she was doing. Eliza sat on the edge of Calder's bed with the quilt in her lap and looked at it for a long time. She heard small feet in the doorway and looked up. Mara was standing there looking at the quilt with an expression that Eliza had never seen on a child's face before and hoped to never be responsible for again, a kind of stripped-down wanting. The face of someone looking at something they love and have lost and cannot get back. Eliza sat very still. Mara took 1 step into the room. Then another. She crossed the floor slowly, like she wasn't entirely sure the ground would hold, and stopped at the edge of the bed and looked at the quilt in Eliza's lap. Eliza turned the quilt carefully, so the best-preserved section faced the child. Double rings in cream and blue. The careful, even stitching. Mara reached out with one hand and touched it, lightly. Just the fingertips. And then she said something. It was barely a breath. Less than a word and more than a sound. But Eliza heard it, and it was a name. Mama. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water. Eliza did not move. She did not speak. She sat very still and let the word take up all the space it needed and didn't try to fill any part of the silence around it with anything. Mara's face crumpled. Not all at once the way a child's face does when it's trying very hard not to cry and then stops trying. She put both hands over her mouth and her whole body shook once, and then the tears came and she couldn't stop them. And she was 6 years old and she missed her mother with everything she had, and there was nothing to be done about that. Eliza set the quilt aside carefully and opened her arms. She did not say anything. She did not have the right to say anything. She was not this child's mother, and she knew it and didn't pretend otherwise. She just opened her arms and waited. Mara climbed into them. She cried for a long time. The kind of crying that has been stored up for 2 years, that comes from so deep there's no bottom to it. Eliza held her and rubbed her back and didn't say a word, not even the usual things people say when they're trying to make grief smaller than it is. She heard Calder in the doorway but didn't look up. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there. She didn't know what his face was doing. She kept her eyes on the back of Mara's head and felt the small body gradually stop shaking. When she finally looked up, the doorway was empty. She could hear him in the hallway, just standing there on the other side of the wall. She could hear him breathing. That night at supper, the three of them sat down to the ham-bone soup she'd made with cornbread. Halfway through the meal, Mara looked at her father and said, in a voice rusty from disuse, "Can Eliza fix the quilt?" Calder went very still. It was the most words she had strung together in 2 years. Gah. He looked at his daughter like a man who had been given back something he'd given up on finding, and Eliza looked at her cornbread and gave him that moment entirely. "She wants to," Calder said finally. His voice was not entirely steady. Mara looked at Eliza. "I'd like to," Eliza said. "I'll need thread." "There's a dry goods store in town," Calder said. "I can get what you need." "Blue and cream," Eliza said. "And a little rose if they have it." Wrote it down on a scrap of paper, carefully, like it was important. She watched his hands while he wrote "work scared," stiff at the knuckle joints from cold. The hands of a man who worked himself past the point of comfort every single day, and she thought, whatever he is, whatever this arrangement is. He wrote down the colors of his wife's quilt like they mattered. That was something. She didn't know yet what kind of something, but she filed it away. Mara went to bed that night without being asked, which Calder told her quietly as they cleaned up the kitchen had not happened in longer than he could remember. He said it the way people say things they've almost stopped hoping for, with a kind of careful gratitude, like they don't want to grip it too hard in case it breaks. "She's a strong child," Eliza said. "She is," he said. "She's yes." He looked at the wall above the fireplace for a moment. Her mother was like that, stronger than she looked. It was the most personal thing he'd said to her in 3 days. She didn't push on it. She finished drying the pot she was holding and hung it back on its hook and said goodnight, and he said goodnight, and she went down the hallway to her room with the latching door. She lay in the dark and thought about the word Mara had said over the quilt. Govan, the way it had come out like something that had been kept under pressure for a very long time and finally found the crack to come through. She thought about her own mother, the wallpaper and the grave and the red clay, 11-year-old girl who had decided she would never disappear. She put her hand on the worn fabric of the blanket covering her and stared at the ceiling. She was still afraid. She was still uncertain. She still did not know what this life was going to look like, or whether she would ever feel at home in it. Something had shifted today in that back bedroom, and she could feel the shift even if she couldn't name it yet. She was not just a name on a piece of paper, not here. Not to that child. That was enough. For one day, that was enough. She pulled the blanket tighter and let the Montana wind outside do whatever it needed to do, and she slept. Fred arrived on a Wednesday. Calder brought it back from town without comment, setting a small paper-wrapped parcel on the kitchen table before he'd even taken off his coat. 3 colors, blue, cream, and a rose so faded it was nearly the color of old skin chosen. She realized when she unwrapped them, with more care than a man who didn't notice things would have taken. Rose was not just any rose. It was close. It was very close to the original. She held it up against the quilt where the color had faded least and looked at it for a long moment. "Good," he asked from across the kitchen. "Very good," she said. Nodded once, hung his coat, and went back outside. That was the whole conversation. But she sat down that evening at the table, with the quilt spread across her lap and the new thread and her needle, and something about the precision of the color match stayed with her the rest of the night, that small, deliberate care from a man who otherwise seemed to have stripped his life of everything that wasn't strictly necessary. Mara pulled a chair up beside her without being asked. She didn't try to help with the sewing. She was 6, and her hands weren't ready for that kind of work, and she seemed to understand it. She just sat there in the warm circle of firelight, with her knees pulled up, and watched Eliza's needle move through the fabric. And sometimes she pointed to a particular section, the blue arc that formed the top of a ring, or a cream square gone thin at the corner, and Eliza would nod and make note of it for later. Worked like that for 2 hours without speaking. Not an uncomfortable silence. Something else. The kind of quiet that settles between people who have decided, without saying so, that they don't need to fill the air between them. When Mara finally went to bed, Calder came in from the barn and stood by the fire, warming his hands, and looked at the quilt on the table and said nothing for a long time. "She sat with you the whole evening?" he said finally. "She did." He looked at the fire. She used to do that with her mother. Sit beside her while she sewed. Eliza kept her eyes on her work. She understood she was being given something, a piece of a story that cost something to tell, and she didn't want to spook it by responding too quickly. "She remembers a lot," Eliza said. "Too much," he said. Then, like he heard how that sounded, "I don't mean it that way. She's young to carry that much. Children carry more than we think they should," Eliza said. "And then they surprise you." He looked at her then, a sideways look assessing. "Spoke to you again today." "She did. She asked me what the pattern was called." "What did you tell her?" "Double wedding ring," Eliza said. She thought that was funny. 2 rings instead of 1. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but lived in the same vicinity. Her mother thought the same thing when she first learned the pattern. He paused. Said it was excessive. Eliza smiled at the quilt. "She sounds like she had opinions." "She had nothing but opinions," he said. There was grief in it, but there was also something else. Something that hadn't fully gone to grief yet, affection. Still warm, the way a coal holds heat long after the fire is out. He seemed to hear himself saying it, and pulled back from it slightly, the way you pull your hand back from something unexpectedly hot. "Good night, Miss Mercer," he said. "Good night," she said. She listened to his boots go down the hallway and heard the door close, and went back to her stitching, and she thought, he is not what I expected. She didn't know yet what that meant for her, but she filed it carefully with the other things she didn't know yet, and she kept sewing until the fire burned low. First week turned into 2. She learned the ranch the way you learn any complicated thing, not all at once, but in pieces, and some pieces harder won than others. She learned that the water pump at the back of the house froze by 5 in the morning in January and had to be coaxed back to life with warm water from the stove. And that if you didn't do this, before Calder came in for breakfast, he would have already done it himself in the cold with bare hands, because he didn't think to ask for help with things he'd been doing alone. She learned that the pantry had a loose board on the second shelf that needed shimming, or the dried beans fell behind it. She learned that Mara would eat almost anything except parsnips, which she regarded with a loathing that seemed personal, and that if you gave her a job, she took it more seriously than most adults took most things. She learned that Calder Boone rose at 4:30 every morning without exception, worked until dark, and ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint. She learned that he was fair with the animals, not sentimental, but fair, with the particular steadiness of a man who understood that cruelty was not the same as toughness and had never confused the two. She learned that he had opinions about weather, the way farmers always do, and that his opinions were usually right, which she suspected annoyed him when they weren't. She learned that he never came to her door. He had said he wouldn't, and he didn't, and she woke each morning in the small room with the latching door and lay in the dark and registered the absence of dread with a kind of wonder that she was ashamed of. She should not have had to wonder. It should not have been remarkable. And yet, what she could not figure out was whether he thought of her as a person. She was useful, she could tell. He knew that the same way you know a good tool is useful, but whether there was anything beneath the utility that he registered, she couldn't determine. He was not unkind. He was not cruel. He was simply closed. Like a room with the shutters pulled, functional from the outside, impossible to see into. She told herself it didn't matter. She was here for the house and the child. She had not come here expecting to be seen. She told herself that often enough that she almost believed it. It was the 3rd week when she found the extent of the financial trouble. She hadn't been looking for it. She was reorganizing the small desk in the corner of the front room. Calder had asked her to find a letter from a feed supplier that had gone missing in the general disorder and in the process of sorting. Through the accumulated papers, she found the ledger. She almost put it back. It wasn't her business. But she had already opened the cover before she understood what it was, and what she saw in the first 3 pages stopped her cold. Numbers were meticulous. Whatever else Calder Boone might let slide, his record-keeping was exact to the cent. Picture those exact records painted was one she recognized in the way you recognize a type of weather, not the specific storm, but the particular color of sky that means something bad is building. Ranch had been operating at a loss for 2 years. Previous winter had taken a significant portion of the cattle herd. Loan against the property had been renegotiated once already, at terms that were worse than the original. Current payment schedule was manageable, barely, if everything went correctly from here. And in her experience, everything going correctly was not a thing you could depend on. Closed the ledger and put it back exactly where she'd found it and sat for a moment at the desk. He hadn't told her. She turned that over in her mind not with anger exactly, but with something like frustration, because she had come into this house blind to the shape of the thing she'd walked into. And that mattered. It mattered practically. You couldn't make decisions about how to manage a household if you didn't know what the household could afford. She found the feed supplier's letter under a county tax notice and brought it to Calder in the barn. He was mending harness, his hands moving with the automatic competence of something done 1,000 times. He looked up when she came in and took the letter. "Thank you," he said. She stood there. He glanced up again. "Something else?" "I found the ledger," she said. "I wasn't looking for it, but I found it." A long pause. He set the harness down. "How bad is it?" she asked. He considered, she thought, whether to tell her it was none of her concern. She watched him think about it and watched him decide against it. "Manageable," he said. "If the spring calves come through well and we don't lose anything else to weather." "If we do lose something to weather?" He was quiet. "I'm not asking to frighten myself," she said. "I'm asking because if I know what we're working with, I can help. If I don't know, I'm just filling time." He looked at her for a moment with that assessing look she'd come to know. Then he leaned back against the stall wall and told her, "Not everything. Not in the way of a man unburdening himself, but in the practical, stripped-down way of a man accounting for resources. The loan balance, the payment coming due in spring, what the cattle could reasonably bring if the market held. What it would take to make up the difference if it didn't." She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "All right." "All right," he repeated. "All right," she said again. "I needed to know. Now I do." She went back inside. He watched her go from the barn doorway for a moment before he picked the harness back up, and if his expression was slightly less closed than it had been before, there was no one there to note it. She started economizing in ways she didn't announce. She stretched the food further without making it worse, an art she'd learned in Georgia, the art of making enough feel like plenty without letting anyone see the working. She kept the fire efficient rather than generous, understanding the difference between warm and wasteful. She began keeping her own notes on what the household used and what it cost, and where there was room to tighten without tightening the wrong things. She also started the quilt repairs in earnest. She worked on it every evening, and Mara sat with her every evening. And over the course of those sessions, something happened that Eliza noticed only in retrospect, a slow accumulation of small moments that added up to something larger. Mara began pointing at sections of the quilt and telling her things. Blue arc, she said one evening, was her mother's favorite color because it was the color of the river in summer. Cream squares came from a dress that got ruined in a rainstorm and couldn't be saved. This piece here, the irregular rose-colored wedge that sat off-center in its ring, was a mistake that her mother had decided to keep because she said the best things were always a little crooked. Eliza listened to all of it. She listened the way you listen, when you understand that the story being told is being told for the first time in a long time, maybe ever, and that the telling itself is important regardless of what she contributed to it. Her mother sounds like she was smart, Eliza said one evening. Mara considered this seriously. She was, she said. She was smarter than Papa. Have you told him that? He knows, Mara said, with the absolute certainty of a child who has observed the world carefully and arrived at accurate conclusions. Eliza bit the inside of her cheek to keep from smiling. I believe you, she said. Mara picked at the edge of a cream square. Do you miss your mother? The question landed with more weight than a 6-year-old could have known to aim. Eliza was quiet for a beat, long enough that it was honest. Yes, she said. She died when I was younger than I'd like. What was she like? Eliza thought about it. She thought about the real answer, which was complicated a woman who had loved her but had made herself small in the service of a man who took it as his due, a woman who had been more afraid than brave, who had passed her fear to her daughter like an inheritance, along with the knowledge that the inheritance was not the whole story. She was quiet, Eliza said, and she was kind when she had the room to be. Mara seemed to understand that there was more to this answer than was being said. She was 6, but she was not simple. That's sad, she said. Little, Eliza agreed. They sewed, or rather, Eliza sewed, and Mara watched in the comfortable quiet that had become their habit. And the fire did what fires do, and the Montana wind did what Montana wind does. After a while, Mara fell asleep in her chair with her head tipped sideways and her hands folded in her lap, and Eliza sat looking at her for a moment before she woke her gently and walked her to bed. She was coming back down the hallway when she nearly collided with Calder. He must have come in from the barn while she was putting Mara down. He was standing in the narrow hallway with a lantern in one hand, and he stepped back quickly when she appeared, and for a moment they were both very close in the small space, and neither of them moved. "Sorry," she said. "No. She's down?" "Just now." He nodded. Smelled of cold and hay, and the particular animal smell of a working barn, not unpleasant in the way that she'd once have assumed, just real the smell of labor and the outdoors and the specific life this man lived every day. "She's been talking more," he said. Not to her exactly. More like a statement he needed to make to the air. "Every day," Eliza said. "She has things to say. She was just waiting to feel safe enough to say them." Looked at the wall. "I didn't know how to. I didn't know what to do for her. After, I kept thinking it would come back on its own." "Talking. It might have," Eliza said carefully. "Children find their way." "It didn't," he said. Beneath those two words was 2 years of a man watching his daughter disappear into silence and not knowing how to reach her, and blaming himself for not knowing. She could hear all of that, packed into 2 syllables. "She didn't need you to fix it," Eliza said. "She needed someone to sit beside her. You did that." He looked at her, a long, direct look, the kind he didn't often give. Like he was trying to figure out whether she believed what she was saying, or whether she was being kind in the empty way people were kind when they didn't know what else to say. She held his gaze. She meant it. She had seen him with Mara, the quiet constancy of it, the way he was simply present, every morning and every evening, steady as the mountains outside. And how that steadiness had been the container that held the child together even when it wasn't enough to bring her back. "I should have gotten someone sooner," he said. "I kept thinking I could manage." "You were managing," she said, "just barely. But barely counts." Something shifted in his face. Not dramatic, he wasn't a dramatic man. But something shifted. "Good night, Miss Mercer," he said. "Good night," she said. She went to her room and she lay in the dark and she thought about the way he'd said, "I kept thinking I could manage," not defensive, not making excuses, just a man being accurate about his own failure in a way that required a kind of courage she hadn't expected from him. She stared at the ceiling and tried to reorganize her understanding of Calder Boone, and found that the reorganization required more room than she'd been leaving for it. First real fight happened over a pig. It was a small pig, a neighbor's pig to be exact, that had gotten through a gap in the fence and rooted up a significant section of what was meant to be the kitchen garden. The plot Eliza had spent 3 mornings breaking the frozen soil on with a pickaxe because the ground was still half frozen. And the work was brutal, and she had done it anyway because spring planting would matter, and the sooner she got the bed ready, the better. She came out one morning to find the pig, its small, satisfied face looking up at her from a trench it had made through the center of the plot. Stood at the edge of the ruined garden and breathed through her nose for a moment. Calder appeared behind her, saw the pig, saw the garden. Said nothing. "Whose pig is this?" she asked. "Harker's," he said. "From the neighboring property." "And the fence gap?" "Fix it today," he said. "I need that garden," she said. "It's not a preference. If we're going to eat well this summer and preserve for winter, I need that garden. Can't afford to buy everything at market." "I know," he said. "Then the fence should have been fixed already." A beat of silence. "You're right," he said. She blinked. She had been bracing for resistance, for the particular defensive posture men took when they were told they'd let something slide. Plain agreement threw her. "Navin, it would help," she said, slightly less sharply. "You told me when things need doing that I can't see from the house. Garden, the fence gap, I would have helped fix it." "That's not your work," he said. "Neither was breaking frozen soil for 3 mornings," she said. "But I did it." He looked at the ruined garden bed. He looked at the pig, which was now attempting to eat the handle of the pickaxe she'd left, leaning against the fence post. He looked at her. "I'll fix the fence and rebuild the bed," he said. "Both today. I'll help." "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to," she said. "I want it done right, and I want it done today." "Shh, give me a shovel." He gave her a shovel. They worked on the garden bed together for 2 hours in the cold morning air, Mara watching from a safe distance and occasionally offering logistical advice that neither of them had asked for. And at the end of it, the bed was better than it had been before the pig, because they'd taken the opportunity to work in some of the composted material from the barn pile. Pig was returned to Harker's farm by Calder, who came back with the information that Harker had apologized and offered a dozen eggs in recompense. Eliza accepted the eggs and made a cake for that evening, which Mara ate 2 slices of and declared superior to all other cakes she had ever had. Gah, it was the first time the 3 of them had done something together and had it come out better than when they started. Eliza noted this. She noted the feeling of it, the ordinary, almost domestic rightness of working beside someone toward a shared purpose, and she put it carefully with the other things she was accumulating about this life. The inventory of moments that were building into something she didn't have a name for yet. The second month, Calder's sister came to call. Her name was Ruth, and she arrived on a Tuesday with a covered dish and an expression that made very clear she had opinions she had been holding in reserve until she had the opportunity to deliver them in person. She was 40, somewhere, with Calder's same dark hair and the direct eyes of someone who'd spent a lifetime in a place where indirectness got you nowhere. She looked at Eliza the way a woman looks at another woman when she's trying to take an honest measure and is prepared to find the measure disappointing. "You're younger than I expected," Ruth said in the hallway. "I'm told that often," Eliza said pleasantly. Ruth looked at the front room. She looked at the clean floor and the fire and the mended curtain at the window and the quilt spread out on the table where Eliza had been working on it. Something in her expression changed. "He didn't tell me about the quilt," Ruth said. "Doesn't tell me much either," Eliza said. "Would you like coffee?" They sat at the kitchen table while Calder was out with the cattle, and Ruth drank her coffee and asked questions in the direct way of someone who has decided that circling around is a waste of time. How old was she? Where was she from? Had she been married before? What did she know about ranching? What had she known about any of it before she came? Eliza answered all of it straightforwardly. She did not perform. She did not try to make herself seem more capable than she was, or less or different from what she was. She had learned already that a person who would be satisfied by performance was not a person whose satisfaction was worth having. Ruth listened. She asked one more question. "Are you happy here?" Considered it. The honest answer was complicated. As honest answers usually were, she was not miserable. She was not afraid. She was not the diminished thing she had feared she would become. But happiness was a large word for what she felt, which was something more like purposeful. Something more like, I am becoming useful, and usefulness is its own kind of dignity. "I'm becoming comfortable," she said. "It's different from where I came from. I'm learning it." Ruth was quiet for a moment. "He's not easy," she said, meaning Calder. "I've noticed he wasn't even before. After Clara died, she stopped. Does better than you might think. He just doesn't show it in ways that are easy to read." "I'm learning to read it," Eliza said. Ruth looked at her over the rim of her coffee cup. Measuring look again, but softer this time. "Good," she said. "Just that." Calder came in for lunch and found his sister and his wife at the kitchen table, talking about something that ended too smoothly when he appeared, in the way of a conversation that has been going on for a while and has no intention of including him. He looked between them with the wariness of a man who recognizes this particular dynamic, even if he can't name it. "Everything all right," he said. "Fine," both women said in slightly different registers. Sat down and ate his lunch and did not ask any more questions, which Eliza thought showed good sense. Ruth helped with the quilt that afternoon. She was an expert. It turned out far better than Eliza's, with a professional's ease and speed that made Eliza's careful stitching look slow. They worked side by side at the table, while Mara sat on the floor nearby and talked. A running commentary on everything from the color of the thread to a story about a crow she'd seen that morning that had been doing something she found philosophically troubling, and Ruth kept working and listening and responding to. Crow's story, with the full seriousness it deserved. "She's talking," Ruth said, quietly, when Mara had taken herself off to find a piece of evidence for her crow argument. "Every day more," Eliza said. Ruth kept her eyes on the quilt. She made 3 careful stitches. Then she said, "I didn't know how to help her after Clara. Kept trying to talk to her, and she'd just look at me. Thought maybe she was angry with us." "She wasn't angry," Eliza said. "She was just somewhere inside herself, somewhere safe. She needed time, and she needed someone who wasn't already too close to the grief." Ruth looked at her. "How old are you really?" 18, Eliza said. 19 in April. Ruth made a sound. It was not dismissive. The sound of someone recalibrating. "Well," Ruth said, "Clara would have liked you. That's probably the best thing I can tell you." Eliza felt the weight of that. She did not say anything. She pulled her thread through and made the next stitch. Quilt grew steadily more whole, and outside the window the Montana sky was the hard blue of late winter. And the afternoon light moved across the floor the way light does when it has no idea what it's moving through. The night Mara asked to sleep with the quilt was the night everything shifted. It happened 3 weeks after Ruth's visit. The quilt was nearly finished, still missing a few sections at the border, but the central rings were repaired, the colors close enough to the original that you had to know the difference to see it. Eliza had spread it out over the back of the chair to let the thread set, and Mara had come in from wherever she'd been and stood looking at it for a long time. "Can I sleep with it?" she asked. Eliza looked at Calder. He was standing by the fireplace, pretending to look at something on the mantel. "It's your mother's quilt," Eliza said. "That's really something for your father to say." Mara turned to Calder. "Papa." He turned from the mantel. He looked at the quilt, finished now and spread across the chair in the warm firelight, and his jaw worked once. "Yes," he said. "Of course." Mara lifted it carefully with both arms, the way you lift something precious and also something you were told not to touch for a long time, and carried it down the hallway to her room. Calder and Eliza stood in the front room in the quiet afterward. "Thank you," he said. He set it to the fireplace, which was where he tended to aim things he found difficult. "It was her quilt," Eliza said. "It should be used." "That's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I mean, thank you for all of it." "House." Mara, not. Another stop. He was a man who had learned to say little, because saying little was safe, and now he was trying to say more and running into all the habits that made it hard. "Brought you here, and I didn't make it easy." "You made it easier than I expected," she said honestly. He looked at her, the direct look again. "I didn't know if this would work," he said. "Any of it. I thought I was making a practical arrangement, and Mara would maybe come around eventually, and the house would get cleaned, and that would be—" He moved his hand, a gesture that meant, "Enough," she said. "And it's not that," he said. She waited. "She's laughing," he said. "Mara, she laughed yesterday at something that Crow did. I haven't heard her laugh in 2 years, and she was laughing, and He stopped. Voice had gone rough at the edges. "I don't know what I expected you to be. I don't think I expected whatever you are." Eliza looked at the fire. She thought about the paper with her name at the top, the $400, her father's back turned to her while she read her own fate. She thought about the platform in Billings, the cold Mara's small face making its terrible measurement. "I didn't know what to expect either," she said. "Are you sorry you came?" Question surprised her. She turned it over honestly, the way it deserved. "No," she said. She meant it. He nodded. He looked at the fire for another moment. Looked at her once more, quickly. Then he picked up the lantern from the table and said, "Good night." She said, "Good night." Off, and she stood alone in the warm room with the empty chair where the quilt had been. She put one hand against her sternum where something was pushing from the inside, something that had no name yet but was growing steadily too large to ignore. She let it be. She went to her room. She did not latch the door, not because she had forgotten, because the forgetting and the remembering had both stopped mattering in a way that told her, more clearly than any word yet spoken, that something in this house had quietly and irrevocably changed. Unlatch of the door was a small thing. Eliza did not make ceremony of it. She simply stopped reaching for it each night. The way you stop reaching for an umbrella when you've stopped believing in rain. And if Calder noticed, and she thought he noticed most things, in his peripheral, unannounced way, he said nothing about it. The March came, and the cold did not ease. If anything, it gathered itself, the way a body gathers itself before a serious effort. Temperature dropped through the floor of what Eliza had thought was the floor. And she learned that Montana had levels of winter she hadn't yet met, and that she had arrived in the pleasant shallows. First week of March brought 3 days of snowfall that didn't stop. Not the heavy, dramatic snow of storms, but the quiet, relentless kind, steady as a second thought, that built without announcing itself until you woke one morning and found the fence posts halved and the barn door requiring 2 men's effort to open. Calder spent those days going out and coming back and going out again, layered in everything he owned. His face reddened to rawness at the cheekbones, his hands in a state of permanent damage that he never mentioned. Eliza kept cabbakemin. She understood, without being told and without resentment, what that meant in practical terms: the fire, the food, the water, the warmth, the sanity. She understood that keeping the inside was its own labor, and that someone had to do it, and that she was the one positioned to do it well. She was not resigned to this. She chose it, the same way she chose everything now, with the deliberateness of a woman who had learned that choice was the only dignity available to her and had decided to exercise it in every possible direction. Mara helped. She helped with genuine investment, hauling small armloads of wood and setting the table and fetching things from the cold storage with the focused efficiency of a child who had decided she was a working member of this household and intended to prove it. She talked while she worked a constant low-level narration of whatever was passing through her mind, observations about the snow and the shape of the ice on the window, and a complex theory she was developing about what the cattle thought about bad weather. Eliza listened to all of it. She asked questions. Mara's theories deserved questions. Probably angry, Mara said one afternoon, hauling a piece of firewood that was almost too big for her arms. Because they didn't choose to be outside. They have the barn, Eliza said. They didn't choose the barn either, Mara said. Didn't choose any of it. Eliza looked at her. That's a very serious thought. Papa says cattle don't think, Mara said. I think they think, and they just don't tell him. I think you might be right, Eliza said. Mara set the wood down with a thud and looked satisfied. I'm usually right, she said. I just don't say it all the time because it makes people feel bad. Eliza turned back to the stove before the child could see her smiling. The storm that arrived on the 12th of March was different from the others. It announced itself in the afternoon with a sky that went the particular green-gray of something serious. Color Eliza had never seen over Georgia and hadn't known to fear until Calder came in for his midday meal and looked out the window at it and set his jaw in a way she'd learned to read. That's bad, she said. Could be, he said. He ate quickly. Didn't finish his coffee. How many cattle are still in the far pasture? He looked at her sideways. He still occasionally startled at the fact that she tracked these things, that she knew the far pasture from the near and had a running estimate of what was where. 11, he said. I'll get them in before it hits. How long do you have? 2 hours. Maybe 3. She looked at the sky through the window. 2, she said. He didn't argue. He was back in his coat before she'd turned from the window, and she listened to him moving through the barn, and then the particular sound of hoofbeats going fast across frozen ground. And then there was nothing but the wind picking up and Mara at the table with a piece of charcoal drawing something on brown paper. What are you drawing? Eliza asked. The cattle, Mara said. So they know someone is thinking about them. Eliza did not have an answer for this. She began banking the fire for what she suspected was going to be a very long night. The storm came in an hour and 40 minutes. She'd been right and she wished she hadn't been. It hit the cabin like something with intention. A wind that found every gap in the chinking and every thin place in the walls and pushed through all of them. And the temperature inside dropped despite the fire, and she fed the fire everything it needed and then fed it a little more. Calder came back with the cattle 40 minutes into the storm, which meant he'd gotten out of the far pasture with minutes to spare and driven 11 frightened animals through a blizzard in the dark. And when he came through the door, he was covered in snow from his hat to his boots, and his hands were shaking with a tremor that he was trying and failing to suppress. She didn't say anything about the hands. She took his coat and hung it and got him to the fire and put hot coffee in his hands and stood back while the heat did what it needed to do. 11, she said. 11, he said. Any losses in the barn? 2 cows look rough. I'll check them again at midnight. His jaw was still tight against the cold. Bank the fire right. I know how to bank a fire, she said. I know, he said. It was not defensive. It was a man confirming that he knew something and had perhaps not said so adequately before now. She made soup. She made it from the ham bone that had been going since that morning and the last of the root vegetables and a good amount of the dried beans, and it was not a refined thing, but it was hot and substantial. And the 3 of them ate it at the table while the storm worked itself into a full-blown fury outside and rattled the shutters and made a sound in the chimney like something trying to get in. Mara had the quilt around her shoulders at the table. Started doing that, wearing it like a cape when she was cold or when she wanted comfort, which Eliza thought was exactly what a quilt was for. Are we going to be all right? Mara asked. She directed the question at the center of the table, not at either of them specifically, which Eliza had noted was how she asked the things she was most uncertain about, as if distributing the question reduced the risk of a bad answer. Yes, Calder said. The cabin is strong, Eliza said. We have enough wood and enough food, and the cattle are in. And each other, Mara said. A small silence settled around that. And each other, Eliza said. Calder looked at his soup. The storm lasted 4 days. 4 days of a world reduced to the 40 feet between the cabin door and the barn door, and even that stretch was a serious undertaking each time. Calder made the trip 6 times a day. Eliza made it once, when the second morning revealed that he'd been inside the barn for longer than the usual check required, and she pulled on her coat and his spare hat and went to see. She found him in the far stall with the 2 sick cows, one hand on the flank of the worse one, not doing anything visible, just being there, which she had learned was something he did, putting himself in contact with the thing he was worried about as if proximity were its own kind of medicine. "She's worse," he said without turning. "What do you need?" "I've done what I can do." He straightened up. In the lantern light, he looked tired in a specific way, not the everyday exhaustion of hard work, but the deeper fatigue of a man who has been carrying worry for a long time and is running low on the reserves that worry requires. "She might come through. She might not. Can she be moved somewhere warmer?" Shook his head. "She's too weak. Moving her would make it worse." "Then we wait," Eliza said. He looked at her, standing there in her coat and his spare hat with the barn cold in her breath, and something flickered across his face that was there and gone too fast to identify. "Didn't have to come out," he said. "You were gone too long," she said. "I'm fine, I can see that," she said. "I came anyway." She stayed with him for another hour. She held the lantern when he needed both hands and passed him things from the supply shelf when he asked and didn't ask questions about things she didn't understand yet. When they came back inside, the snow was falling sideways, and the cold hit her face like a slap, and she was breathless from it by the time they got to the door. Inside, Mara had made something that was supposed to be biscuits, and was actually more in the category of determined bread, denser than intended but warm and earnestly offered. "I made them myself," she said. Calder looked at the biscuits. Picked one up. It had the heft of a small stone. "You used the recipe?" he asked carefully. "Mostly," Mara said. Calder took a bite. He chewed. He kept his expression extremely neutral. "Good," he said. Eliza took one. She chewed. They were not good. They were barely edible and extremely effortful, and made with such obvious pride that she chewed every bite with gratitude. Next time, Eliza said, "We'll make them together. You can show me what you changed." Mara looked pleased. "I added more salt," she said. "Because Papa likes salt." Calder looked at his biscuit. "I do like salt," he confirmed. Finished the whole thing. On the 3rd day of the storm, the cow died. Calder came in at the midnight check and stood in the kitchen and said it plainly. The way he said most things, flat, direct. No theater, and Eliza heard beneath the flatness the sound of a man absorbing a loss on top of other losses that hadn't yet finished settling. She poured him coffee. He sat at the kitchen table and put his hands around the cup and stared at the surface of it. "It's $120, he said. She said nothing. She knew he wasn't asking her to help him calculate it. He was just saying it out loud, the way you say a number that is going to be a problem, so that the air can hold it for a moment instead of your chest. "Spring calves will need to make up for it," he said. "And if they do and the price holds, we'll be close to even." He said it without much confidence. Mathematics of a marginal operation were not mathematics he had ever been able to fully trust. She sat down across from him. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the payment schedule he'd described, the loan that had been renegotiated at punishing terms, the careful month-by-month survival arithmetic of a ranch with no slack left in it. "How close is close?" she asked. He looked up. "I need to know," she said. "To worry." To told her. She listened. When he finished, the silence between them held the numbers and what the numbers meant. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one. "All right," she said. "You keep saying that," he said. "Because it keeps being true," she said. "It's hard. Might get harder. That's all right. We'll find a way through it." "Nah." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the neutral assessment he usually gave her, not the careful gratitude he offered when Mara did something that surprised him, but something rawer than either. Something that hadn't been given much air in a long time. "I don't know what I'd do if I lost this place," he said. "I built this with my—" He stopped. He put one hand flat on the table. "My father started it. I expanded it. Claire and I—" He stopped again. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I know." He looked at his hand on the table. "I just want you to know why it matters. Not because it's an asset. Because it's everything that happened that was worth anything happened here." She understood. She understood it in the specific way of someone who had never had a place that meant that, and who recognized the shape of it in someone who did, the way you recognize a language you never learned but somehow know the music of. "Then we make sure you keep it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, Shan finished his coffee and went back out into the storm to check the surviving cattle. The storm broke on the morning of the fourth day and left behind a silence so complete it was almost loud. Snow had piled against the east side of the cabin to the windowsill. The barn was accessible only through a narrow channel Calder dug in the hour after the wind stopped, working with a steadiness that Eliza watched from the window and recognized as the stubbornness of a man who was not going to let any of this win. Mara stood beside her at the window watching him too. "Never stops," Mara said. "No," Eliza said. "Mama used to say that was good and bad," Mara said. "Good because things got done. Bad because he forgot to stop when he was supposed to." Eliza looked at the child. "Your mother was paying attention." "She always was," Mara said simply. The days after the storm were the hardest work Eliza had done since arriving. Cabin needed repairs, gaps in the chinking that the wind had exploited, a shutter hinge pulled loose, the pump once again frozen solid and requiring coaxing. Cattle needed extra feeding. The remaining sick cow needed watching. On the kitchen garden she'd worked so hard on was buried under 2 feet of heavy wet snow that she had to dig out before it compacted into something that would damage the bed below. She did not complain. She worked until her hands were ruined and her back was loud about what it thought of her choices, and then she worked a little more. And each evening she came inside and rebuilt the fire and made supper and sat with Mara and the quilt in the warm circle of the front room and felt, despite everything, that she was in the right place. It was not happiness, still, not exactly, but it was something she didn't have a better word for, a sense of fit, like something slotting correctly into something else. It was the second week after the storm when Calder came home one afternoon without the horse. She was in the kitchen and she heard the sound of him returning, or didn't hear the sound she expected, rather. No hoofbeats, just boots. She looked out the kitchen window and saw him coming up the road on foot, his coat collar up, his hat pulled low. Yan, no horse. She met him at the door. "Where's Samson?" she said. Came inside. He took off his hat. He had the look of a man who had made a decision that cost him and was not going to revisit it. "Sold him," he said. She stared at him. Samson was not just a horse. She understood this in the specific way she understood most things about this ranch, not because she'd been told, but because she'd paid attention. Samson was the horse Calder had broken himself 8 years ago, that had been his primary working animal ever since. Mentioned it once, in passing, the way you mention something so woven into your life that it barely needs naming. She'd seen them together. She'd seen how the horse moved for him, with the ease of long familiarity, and how Calder's hand rested on his neck in the particular way of a man who trusts an animal. "Why?" she said. She thought she knew, but she needed him to say it. Reached into his coat pocket and set a roll of bills on the table. "Storm damage to the Hendersons' fence," he said. "They're claiming it was cattle from our herd that got through and did the damage to their east field." Might be true, might not be. The lawyer said fighting it would cost more than settling. He looked at the money on the table. "Rest of it's for supplies." In a pause, "There's a coat at the dry goods store. Proper winter coat. I put a deposit on it." She looked at him. "You need a proper coat," he said. "What you came in isn't enough for Montana. It wasn't enough in January, and that was nothing compared to what we just came through." She looked at the bills on the table. She looked at him. She thought about what it meant that this man, who had stripped his life down to the absolute necessary, had sold the horse he'd worked with for 8 years so that she would not be cold. She did not cry. She did not make it dramatic. She was not that kind of woman, and even if she had been, she didn't think he'd know what to do with it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. "Could have told me. We could have found another way." "Maybe," he said, "but this was the fastest way and the one I was certain of." She looked at the money on the table. Gah, she looked at him, standing there in his worn coat with his hat in his hands, the way he'd been standing on the platform in Billings the day she arrived. The same posture, the same steadiness, but she was not the same woman who had stepped off that train, and the man before her was no longer the closed and guarded stranger who had taken her suitcase without looking at her. "Ah." She felt something rise in her chest, move through her throat, arrive somewhere in her expression that she couldn't fully contain. "Calder," she said. He looked at her. "Just looked. Waiting, I love you," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. Not a declaration she wasn't that kind of woman. She kept saying it to herself, and it kept being true but real. Plainly real. The way true things usually are when you stop managing them. Went very still. She watched the stillness move through him and waited. "Eliza," he said. His voice had gone somewhere she'd never heard it go. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said. He took one step toward the table. He put his hand flat on it, beside the money, the same gesture as that night in the kitchen after the cow died. Like he needed something solid. I know I don't have to. I want to. He looked at the table. He looked at her. I don't know how to say it right. I stopped being a man who said things like that a long time ago, and I don't know if I remember how. Don't have to say it right, she said. I don't want to say it wrong, he said. You deserve it, said Wright. She crossed the kitchen. She stood close enough that she could see the weather damage to his face, the red and the roughness of a man who had been outside in Montana winters for over a decade. She thought he was not handsome in the way of men in magazines, and she did not care at all. She put her hand over his on the table. He turned his hand over and held hers. His grip was careful, like he was holding something he was afraid of damaging. I love you, he said. He said it the way he said things that cost him flat and direct, with no performance, the way honesty sounds when it comes from somewhere that doesn't have room for decoration. She held his hand, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the snow was melting off the cabin roof in slow drips, and somewhere in the rest of the house Mara was having an apparently heated discussion with the cat about something. And Eliza stood in the kitchen of a ranch she had not chosen, and held the hand of a man she had not chosen, and felt the particular weight of realizing that the best things rarely arrived by plan. She did not know yet about Silas Crow. She found out on a Tuesday in late March, which was becoming, she noted with grim humor, day of the week with a pattern of delivering bad news. Calder had gone to town for supplies and came back with his jaw set and the specific silence that meant he was arranging something inside his head before he said it. She had learned this signal. She waited for it to complete. Mara was in her room. That was the first thing Calder checked before he started talking. There was a man in town, he said. Silas Crow. He said the name like it had a taste. I don't know him, she said. You won't want to, he said. He sat at the kitchen table. Put both hands flat on it, that gesture again. He's been buying up land around the valley for the past 8 months. Distressed properties, mostly ranches that got hit hard in the winter, families that had to take bad loans and can't make the payments. He paused. He was at the bank today when I was there. She felt the room shift slightly, the way it does when you realize the ground you're standing on has been changing shape without your noticing. Spoken to our banker, Calder said. About our loan? Bank sold it, he said. Sold the note 3 weeks ago. I didn't know until today. His voice was even, but his hands weren't. They pressed harder against the table, the knuckle joints white. Crow bought it. He owns our debt. She sat down. She needed a moment to understand the full shape of it. The loan, the terms, the payment coming due. And now the debt was not held by a bank that had a reputation to maintain and neighbors to answer to, but by a man who had been systematically acquiring land from people who couldn't fight back. When is the payment due, she said. 30 days, he said. Accelerated the schedule. It was in the fine print of the renegotiated terms the note holder has the right to call the full balance if the note changes hands. The full balance, she repeated. $432, he said. Number sat between them on the table like something physical. She thought about the ledger. She thought about the spring calves and the timber prices and the dead cow and Samson gone. Gah! She thought about what $432 meant against what they had, and she did the arithmetic that she already knew the answer to. What happens if we can't pay, she said. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. He takes the ranch, she said. Takes the ranch, he confirmed. Outside, the afternoon had gone the gray of coming weather, not a storm this time, just the dull, persistent gray of early spring, trying to decide whether to commit to warmth or pull back into cold. She looked at the window, and she thought about a man she'd never met sitting in a bank office deciding that a ranch that other people had built and bled for and buried a woman on was a useful acquisition. She thought about the word acquisition. She felt something in her go very still and very clear, the way it did sometimes when a situation was so plainly unacceptable that all the complicated feelings about it simplified into a single point. Can we find a way, she said. Eliza, no, she said. Listen to me, we find a way. 30 days is 30 days. What do we have and what can we do with it? He looked at her. Start talking, she said. I need to know everything. Started talking. She listened, she asked questions. She did not panic, and she did not minimize, and she did not pretend the situation was other than what it was dire, genuinely dire, in the specific way of problems that have no clean solution and require instead a constellation of partial ones. She had come to Montana on a train with one battered suitcase and no expectations and had built something out of it anyway. She was not going to sit across a kitchen table from a man she loved, in a house she'd made her own, and tell him that something built by other people's selfishness was the final word on what her life amounted to. She was not her mother. She was not a woman who disappeared into the wallpaper. She was Eliza Mercer Boone, and she had been underestimated by people with more power than Silas Crow, and they had all been wrong. She pulled a piece of paper toward her and picked up the pencil from the counter and said, "All right, let's start from the beginning." And they did. The piece of paper filled up fast. Calder talked, and Eliza wrote, and between them they accounted for everything: the cattle, calves expected in April, timber work he could pick up at the Harlow Mill 30 miles east, small savings he'd kept in a tin under the floorboard that he hadn't touched since Clara died, because touching it had felt like admitting things he wasn't ready to admit. She wrote it all down in her careful slanted hand, and when he stopped talking, she looked at the column of numbers and did the arithmetic twice to make sure she hadn't made an error she was hoping for. She hadn't. Even with everything: the calves selling well, the timber work, the tin under the floorboard, they were short. Significantly short. The kind of short that doesn't close with optimism or good weather. Timber work, she said. How much realistically? Harlow pays $1.20 a day, he said. If I start Monday and work every day until the payment is due, that's $36, she said. She'd already done it. Give or take. She looked at the paper. We need 432. Between the tin and the cattle and the timber, we're at, she added the column again, just under 300. Calves come in strong if, he said. If, she agreed. Word sat there between them, doing its honest and unhelpful work. Farming was made of ifs, so was most of life. But ifs did not pay notes held by men like Silas Crow. There's Ruth, he said. No, she said immediately. Looked at her. She has her own household, Eliza said. We don't borrow from family for something we can solve ourselves. We might not be able to solve this ourselves. We haven't tried yet, she said. Quiet. He had the look of a man who had been trying to solve things himself for 2 years and had a complicated relationship with that particular approach. She understood the look. She did not soften what she was about to say because of it. Take the timber work, she said. Start Monday, work every day you can. I'll manage the ranch and the calves. You can't manage calving season alone. Can't manage it the way you manage it, she said. But I can watch for trouble and send for you if something goes wrong. Mara helps. We'll learn what we need to learn. He looked at her with an expression that was half admiration and half plain worry, and did not try to dress it up as either. Still leaves us short, he said. I know, she said. I'll handle the rest. How? She looked at the paper. She looked at the red dress hanging on the peg by her bedroom door, the one she'd come west in, bright Georgia red of it, that had seemed so out of place on the Billings platform, and still sometimes caught the firelight in a way that made Mara say it looked like something was burning. I have an idea, she said. Let me work it out, and I'll tell you when I have something real. Did not like not knowing. She could see that. He was a man who needed to account for things, to know what was in each column, and she was asking him to leave one column blank on trust. All right, he said finally. All right, she said. She folded the paper in half and held it on the table under her palm and thought about red fabric and what she could make from it. Her idea was not elegant. It was not the kind of plan that someone with more options would have arrived at. Well, it was the plan of a woman who had grown up with not enough and had learned to look at scraps and see what they might become. She started with the dress. She did not destroy it all at once. She was careful, deliberate, the way she was with anything that couldn't be undone. She took the scissors to the hem first, then to the sections that had gone thin from wear, leaving the good fabric intact. What she had when she was done was a collection of red cloth pieces in various sizes not large. Gone? None of them. But more than nothing. And more than nothing was where she always started. She stayed up late that first night cutting and pinning, and by midnight she had the shape of something, a bag. Small, drawstring, with a simple geometric embroidery across the front, a pattern she'd learned from her mother. One of the few useful things that had come down to her from that direction. She worked the embroidery in white thread against the red, and when she held it up to the lantern, she thought, someone will want this. Someone did. She took it to town 3 days later, when Calder had already left for the timber mill with a bedroll and 3 days' worth of food and the quiet, loaded goodbye of a man who did not want to leave and knew he had to. She took it to the dry goods store, where the owner's wife, a woman named Mrs. Purcell, who had the kind of taste that outpaced her surroundings, was standing behind the counter, looking bored with the January selection of plain calico. Eliza set the bag on the counter, Mrs. Purcell looked at it, picked it up. She turned it over, examining the stitching. How much, she said. $2, Eliza said. She had thought about this number for a long time. Too low, and she'd signal that it wasn't worth more. Too high, and she'd go home with it. Mrs. Purcell pulled $2 from the register without further negotiation. Eliza walked back to the wagon with $2 in her pocket and the beginning of a plan that was starting to look like a plan. She went home and cut more fabric. She had very little red left. So she started looking at everything else worn clothing that couldn't be mended further. Curtains with good sections still in them. Remnants of a bolt of blue cotton she'd found in the back of the closet that must have been Clara's and that she touched with care, aware of what she was handling. She worked at night, after Mara was in bed, with the fire down low and the lantern close, and her hands moving through the familiar motions of cutting and pinning and stitching while the ranch breathed around her. She made bags. She made 5, then 8, each one slightly different shapes, different embroidery patterns, one with a small wildflower design along the top edge that she'd improvised and liked better than she expected. She made a child's apron from a piece of the blue cotton, with a rabbit embroidered on the front pocket, because she thought of Mara and couldn't stop herself. She took the apron upstairs to Mara's room and left it on the chair beside her bed and said nothing about it. Next morning, Mara appeared in the kitchen, wearing it, her expression indicating that she considered it a matter of course that this was now her apron, and she had always had it. Rabbit, Mara said, pointing to the pocket. I thought you'd like it, Eliza said. I love it, Mara said, with the total conviction of someone who did not see any need to manage her feelings about things. She stroked the rabbit's ears with one finger. Can you make one for Mrs. Henshaw? Who is Mrs. Henshaw? The school teacher. She likes rabbits. She has a picture of one on her desk. Eliza looked at the child in the blue apron with the embroidered rabbit and thought, I could make 10 of those and sell every one. Does Mrs. Henshaw come to town on Saturdays? She asked. Everyone comes to town on Saturdays, Mara said, with the authority of someone who had lived here all her life, which she had. By the end of the first week, Eliza had 12 pieces ready. Getting them to buyers was its own problem. She could not simply stand in the street and hawk them like a peddler that would close doors. She understood that instinctively. Women who would pay $2 or $3 for an embroidered bag were women who bought things in shops and received things as gifts, not women who stopped for a stranger on the sidewalk. She needed a venue. She thought about Mrs. Purcell, who had bought the first bag without hesitation. She took her 12 pieces back to the dry goods store on a Wednesday morning and laid them on the counter and asked, as directly as she knew how to, whether Mrs. Purcell would be willing to display them for sale, with a percentage for the store. Mrs. Purcell looked at the pieces laid out on her counter, picked up each one. She held the embroidered wildflower bag up to the light from the window. 20%, Mrs. Purcell said. 15, Eliza said. Mrs. Purcell set the bag down. 17.5, and I'll put them in the front window. Done, Eliza said. She was back home by noon. She had nothing left to sell and 17.5% of future sales, and a front window in the only dry goods store in town where every woman in the county came on Saturdays. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the piece of paper with the columns of numbers and thought about what she needed and how many pieces she'd have to sell to get there. And the number was large, but it was not impossible, and not impossible was all she'd ever needed. Mara found out what was happening on the 4th day. When she came home from an errand at the neighbor's, to find Eliza at the kitchen table surrounded by fabric and thread with her coat, still on from the morning, because she hadn't had time to take it off. Mara stood in the doorway and took in the scene. Are we going to lose the ranch? She asked. She said it, with the directness of a child who had been around enough adult conversation to understand when something serious was being managed quietly, and who had decided she preferred to know. Eliza looked at her. We're trying very hard not to, she said honestly. Is that why Papa went to the mill? Yes. Mara came and sat at the table. She looked at the fabric, a half-finished bag in Eliza's hands. The small collection of dyes Eliza had set up in jars along the windowsill walnut hull for brown, onion skin for yellow, a jar of crushed pokeweed berries she'd been experimenting with for a deep plum color that had come out better than she expected. What can I do? Mara asked. Eliza looked at the jars. Those berries, she said, nodding toward the pokeweed. I need more of them. There's a stand of the bushes along the creek bed. The dried ones from last fall, the berries are still on them, frozen but usable. I've been meaning to collect them and haven't had time. Mara looked at the jars. She looked at Eliza. I know where they are, she said. Mama and I used to pick them. The sentence landed gently, without the weight it might have carried 2 months ago. Mara said it the way she was beginning to say most things about Clara, present tense in memory. Past tense, in fact. Neither of these things a crisis anymore. Will you show me when I have a free morning? Eliza said. Saturday, Mara said. I don't have school Saturday. They went on Saturday. They hiked along the creek bed in rubber boots with a basket between them, and Mara knew exactly where the pokeweed grew, because she'd been there before, and children remember the geography of their childhoods with a specificity that adults lose. They came back with a full basket of the dried berries, and while Eliza set up the dye bath, Mara sat on the kitchen floor and sorted the berries into the cracked ones, and the whole ones with a focus that suggested she'd found her purpose. Cracked ones make a darker color, Eliza told her. Use those first, Mara sorted with renewed intensity. I'm good at this, she said. You are, Eliza agreed. I'm going to do this every time, Mara said. I'm the berry sorter. Eliza, her hands already stained purple to the wrist, said, Berry sorter is a very important job. Mara accepted this as obvious fact. Calder came back at the end of the first week, looking like a man who had been working timber in early spring, which was to say he looked like he'd lost a fight with the landscape. He was thinner already, hard physical labor, burning through reserves faster than ranch work, which was at least broken up by the rhythms of animal care. He had a cut on his forearm from a saw that had glanced wrong, wrapped in cloth that needed changing, and he moved with the particular stiffness of muscles that had not been used in quite this way before and were registering their objections. Sat at the table and looked at the kitchen, which had been transformed. Fabric everywhere on the chairs, over the backs, pinned to a length of rope she'd strung across the corner to dry dyed pieces. Jars of color on the windowsill, the smell of boiling dye faintly in the air despite the window she'd cracked. Mara at the table with a basket of berries, sorting with great authority. How much, he said. He looked at Eliza. She went to the tin on the shelf, the small tin she'd repurposed for her earnings, separate from the household tin, and counted out the bills and coins and put the total on the table. $43.70. He looked at it. In 1 week, the front window helps, she said. And Mrs. Purcell told the minister's wife, who told the women at the social club, and 2 of them came to the store specially. He looked at the money. He looked at the fabric strung across the corner. Looked at Mara. I sorted the berries, Mara said. Cracked ones make darker colors. I figured that out. She did, Eliza confirmed. It's a real contribution. Calder looked at his daughter in the way he sometimes looked at her, like he was catching up to who she was becoming and finding it outpaced his expectations. That's good, Bug, he said. Mara received this with dignity. Looked back at Eliza. He said nothing for a moment, and she had learned enough about his silences to let this one complete itself. Cut needs looking at, she said, nodding at his arm. Fine. It needs looking at, she said again. Not a request. He let her look at it. It was deeper than she'd like, but not infected, and she cleaned it properly and wrapped it in fresh cloth, and he sat still for all of it, with the patience of a man who had decided that this was easier than arguing. Have to eat more, she said when she was done. She'd noticed the sharpness under his jawline. I'll send more food with you next week. There's enough? There isn't, she said. You're burning through it. I'll pack more. He was quiet. How many more days can Harlow give you, she said. As many as I need. It's a big timber contract. He's glad for the labor. She did the arithmetic. If you work the full 30 days, that's $36. We're at 43 from the sales. The tin has 22. Spring calves. She paused. First one came this morning, he said. Before I left. Healthy. She felt some of the tension in her chest ease just slightly. How many more expected? 8, if the winter count was right. Market price? Depends on the market. Early May if they're strong. 40, maybe $50 if we get good weight on them. Looked at the paper she'd pushed toward him. She'd kept the columns updated. He went through it with his eyes, and she could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd been doing all week. We're still short, he said. I know, she said. I'm working on it. Hooked up? How short? $50, give or take. Depending on the calves. She paused, probably closer to 60 to be safe. $50 was not an impossible number. It was also not a number she currently had any clear idea how to find. Put his hand flat on the table. She put her hand over it, stayed like that for a moment, not talking. while Mara sorted berries on the other side of the table and hummed something to herself that had no particular tune, and the fire made the sounds fires make when they're doing their job. And outside, the early spring afternoon was trying to convince the world it was warmer than it was. "I'll figure out the 60, she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. "We'll figure it out," he said. She let him have the we. True, after all. The days took on a rhythm that Eliza would remember later as one of the strangest and most clarifying periods of her life. Calder left before dawn on Mondays and came back on Friday evenings, and in between, ranch ran on her competence and Mara's enthusiastic assistance and the stubbornness of a woman who had decided that failure was not available to her as an option. She managed the calves with more confidence than she'd expected of herself. 2 of the 8 were born while Calder was gone, and she handled both with the careful attention she'd given everything since arriving in Montana, learning as she went, making notes, not panicking when she didn't know something, but finding out and dealing with it. First calf she'd sat with for 3 hours in the cold before it was steady on its feet. She'd come inside with her hands filthy and her knees aching, and Mara waiting with hot coffee she'd made herself, imperfectly, but with complete dedication. "Is the baby all right?" Mara asked. "She's all right," Eliza said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. "She's small, but she's stubborn. That usually works out." Mara considered this, "like you," she said. Eliza looked at the child. "Small and stubborn," Mara said helpfully. Eliza drank her coffee. "Thank you, Mara." "You're welcome," Mara said. Sales continued. Mrs. Purcell's front window was apparently the most effective advertising in Billings County, because each time Eliza brought in a new batch of pieces, she came back with cash from the previous batch and sometimes orders women who had seen something they liked and wanted something similar in different colors, or a different size, or with a specific embroidery pattern. They'd describe in the breathless approximations of people who knew what they wanted but not how to say it technically. She made what they described. She was good at translating vague want into specific stitch, and she got better at it the more she did it. By the 3rd week she had a waiting list, which was something she had not expected, and which meant she had to stay up later and wake up earlier and work through the middle of the day while Mara was at school. She was tired in the specific bone-deep way of a woman who was carrying more than she should and doing it anyway because the alternative was worse. She did not complain. She worked. By the 26th day, she had $112 in the small tin on the shelf, and she was $51 short of what they needed, and she had 4 days left. She sat at the kitchen table on the evening of the 26th day with the paper in front of her and the numbers that didn't close, and for the first time since she'd started, she let herself sit with the shape of the problem honestly, without immediately reaching for the next solution. It was a lot of money. In 4 days, she had sold everything she could sell and taken every order she could fill and worked every hour she could work, and she was still $51 short. She could ask Ruth. She had told Calder she wouldn't, and she'd meant it, but she could. Ruth would give it without hesitation, she thought. Ruth had that quality. She could try to negotiate with the bank, with Crow's representative, whoever was managing the loan. She had no reason to think that would go anywhere. Men like Crow did not buy distressed notes because they planned to be negotiated with. She could wait and see whether the calves came in higher than expected, and the arithmetic miraculously changed. That was not a plan. That was hope dressed up as a plan, and she'd never confused the two. She folded the paper and put her face in her hands and breathed. Mara was in bed. Calder was at the mill. The ranch was quiet in the way of a house that holds its breath. She sat like that for a while. Not crying, she was past crying about it, which was its own kind of tired. Just sitting with the shape of a problem she had worked every angle of and come up 3 days short. Then she heard the wagon. She didn't move at first, because the sound was wrong for Calder, the wrong time, the wrong weight of wheels. She went to the window and looked out into the evening dark and saw a lamp on a wagon seat and a figure she didn't immediately recognize. Wagon stopped at the gate. The figure climbed down. She recognized the walk before she recognized the face. Stern, direct, no wasted motion, Agnes Whitlock. Agnes Whitlock was not a woman Eliza knew well. She was the nearest neighbor in the other direction from Harker's. A widow who had managed her own property alone for 15 years and had the reputation of someone who did not involve herself in other people's business and expected the same consideration in return. Eliza had spoken to her twice once at the dry goods store, And once, when Agnes had stopped on the road to tell Calder, in the clipped tones of someone delivering information rather than making conversation, that one of his fence posts on the eastern boundary was leaning at an angle that would cause problems. She was 60 or close to it, with white hair pulled back, with no interest in anything decorative, and the kind of face that had spent decades outdoors and showed it without apology. She came to the door and knocked twice. Eliza opened it. Agnes looked at her. She had something in her hand, a flat cloth pouch, worn, the kind that held documents or money, and had been used for a long time. "Mrs. Boone," she said. She used the name that Eliza had not yet formally made official, and did it without ceremony, as though it was simply the accurate word. "Mrs. Whitlock," Eliza said. "Come in." Agnes came in. She looked at the kitchen, the fabric, got the jars, tin on the shelf, organized evidence of a woman working a problem with everything she had. She set the flat pouch on the table. "There's $100 in there," she said. Eliza looked at the pouch. She looked at Agnes. "And I want 10 of those embroidered bags," Agnes said. "One's in the window at Purcell's. My niece's wedding is in September, and I need gifts." She said this in the tone of someone presenting a commercial transaction, nothing more. Eliza looked at the pouch. 10 bags at her current price was $25–30. "Not 100. Mrs. Whitlock," she started. "Agnes," the woman said. "Agnes," Eliza said, "this is more than 10 bags." Agnes pulled out a chair at the kitchen table and sat down in it with the deliberate authority of someone who had decided where they were going to be and intended to be there. "I know that," she said. "The rest is for the bags I'll order from you over the next 2 years, which I'm paying now because it suits me." She looked at Eliza steadily. "Are you going to stand there arguing about it, or are you going to sit down?" Eliza sat down. Agnes folded her hands on the table. She looked at the jars of dye on the windowsill, and at the fabric strung across the corner, and at the small tin on the shelf. And her expression was not soft. It was never soft, Eliza suspected, but it was something. "I came here 40 years ago," Agnes said, "on a train from Ohio. Not a mail-order arrangement, but not far from it. Man I'd met twice. Land I'd never seen." She said it flatly, the facts of an old story she'd stopped needing to tell in any particular way. "I know what it is to walk into a house that isn't yours yet and decide whether you're going to make it yours. I know what that costs." Eliza did not say anything. She was listening. "I watched what you've been doing," Agnes said. "I come to town. I talk to people, even if people think I don't." Something moved across her face that was as close to dry humor as Eliza had yet seen on it. "Purcell's wife talks. The minister's wife talks. Everybody in this county talks, except the people who pretend they don't." She looked at the tin on the shelf. "You're short." $51, Eliza said. "The 100 covers it and gives you something left over for the next thing that goes wrong," Agnes said. "Something will." "I know," Eliza said. "Crow is not going to stop after this," Agnes said. Her voice had gone flatter, if possible. "He's patient and he has money, and he has been buying up this valley one foreclosure at a time. Paying this note doesn't make you safe. It makes you standing." "Standing is enough for now," Eliza said. Agnes looked at her for a long moment. It was the same kind of look Ruth had given her months ago measuring, but arriving somewhere different. "Yes," Agnes said, "it is." She stood smoothing her skirt once with a businesslike hand. "I'll want the first 2 bags by the end of next week. Blue, if you have it." "My niece likes blue." "I have blue," Eliza said. She stood as well. She felt something inside her that was too large for the moment, but was what it was. "Agnes, don't thank me yet," Agnes said, moving toward the door. "The note paid and the ranch held, and then thank me if you still want to." She pulled her coat on in the brisk manner of someone who'd rather move than stand. "That man came to me last year," she said without looking back. "Crow. Made me an offer for my property, very polite. Very certain I'd take it." She opened the door. She looked at Eliza over her shoulder. "I told him the same thing I expect you'll tell him when it comes to it," she said. She went out into the evening. Eliza stood in the doorway and watched the lamp on the wagon swing as Agnes turned it around. She held the cloth pouch in both hands and felt the weight of it, the actual physical weight of what it meant. She stood in the doorway of her house in the Montana dark until the lamp disappeared around the bend in the road. Then she went inside and sat at the table and opened the pouch and counted it, and it was exactly $100. Then she picked up her piece of paper with the columns, and she added it in and looked at the final number, and felt the breath she had been holding for 26 days move out of her body all at once. They were going to make it. She folded the paper once, very precisely, and put it in her apron pocket. She got up and checked on Mara, who was asleep with the quilt pulled up to her chin, and the cat arranged at the foot of her bed, with the dignity of an animal who had decided this was his place now and dared anyone to say otherwise. She stood in the doorway of that room for a moment, looking at the child and the quilt in the low light. She went back to the kitchen, sat down, and started on the first of Agnes Whitlock's 10 blue bags. She finished the first blue bag at 2 a.m. She held it up to the lantern and turned it slowly, checking the stitching the way she always did, not with vanity, not looking for compliments she'd give herself, but with the critical eye of someone who understood that the work was the argument. Every stitch was the case she was making. Every even line was the answer to everyone who had looked at her and calculated her worth in dollars and found the number small. She set it on the table beside the cloth pouch and went to bed. She slept better than she had in 26 days. Calder came home on Friday evening, and she met him at the door with the paper, the columns, the final number, the $100 from Agnes, and what it meant when added to everything else. She didn't build to it. She just handed him the paper and let him read it, stood in the doorway with his coat still on, and read the numbers twice. She watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before, a loosening, like a fist opening, like a man whose body had been braced for a blow for so long that the absence of the blow required its own adjustment. Agnes Whitlock, he said. 10 bags, Eliza said. Blue. And apparently she's been watching what I've been doing and decided it was worth investing in. He looked up from the paper. She came to see if a mail-order bride knew how to hold her ground, Eliza said. I think she decided I did. He was quiet for a moment. The way he got quiet when something was moving through him that he was still sorting out. You did this, he said. Most of this. You worked 30 days at the mill. I sent money home, he said. You built something. He looked at the kitchen, the fabric, the organized chaos of a small business operated from a kitchen table. The jars of dye she hadn't put away yet because there were more orders to fill. I didn't know you could do this. Neither did I, she said honestly. Not at this scale. He set the paper down on the table. He looked at it for another moment. Then he looked at her, the direct look, the one he gave when he had something real to say, and was preparing to say it without the armor of indirection. Go to town Monday, he said. Pay it off Monday, she agreed. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face, not a dramatic gesture, not the kind of thing you'd find in a story that was trying to sell you something. Just his hand, rough and calloused and cold from the ride, against her cheek. She leaned into it slightly, just slightly, and they stood in the doorway of their kitchen like that for a moment. Papa's back, Mara announced from directly behind Eliza. Both turned. Mara was standing in the hallway in her nightgown with her hair loose, looking at them with the satisfaction of someone who had arranged a scene she found pleasing. Supposed to be in bed, Calder said. I heard the wagon, Mara said, without any indication that this explained or excused anything. Came forward and wrapped her arms around his waist. Put one hand on the back of her head. And Eliza stepped aside and went to put the kettle on because he'd need something hot after the ride. And behind her, she could hear Mara telling him about the calves and the berries and the bags and the cat's continued occupation of the foot of her bed. A full accounting of 30 days, delivered in approximately 4 minutes, with no detail considered too small to include. She listened to it and felt something in her chest that was warm and complicated and did not have a precise word, which she had decided was fine. Not everything needed naming. Some things just needed to be lived in. Monday came cold and clear, the particular clarity of early April in Montana when the sky decides to be honest about how blue it actually is. They drove to town together, all 3 of them, Mara between them on the wagon bench in her good coat, cloth pouch of money in Eliza's lap, with the careful weight of something that had cost a great deal to accumulate. Calder drove. Did not talk much on the way in, but his silence was the settled kind. Not the closed kind, and Eliza had learned to tell the difference. Bank was a brick building on the main street with a window that reflected the sky and a door that was heavier than it needed to be, which she suspected was a deliberate choice. Power dressed itself in architecture the way it dressed itself in everything else, making itself look permanent, making you feel temporary by comparison. She had not met Silas Crow yet. She had formed an image of him from Calder's sparse description and Agnes's flat summary, and from the way people in town said his name with a particular slight pause before it, way you paused before saying the name of something you'd rather not acknowledge. He was already there. He was sitting in a chair beside the banker's desk, as though he'd arrived early specifically to be in the room first, which she thought he probably had. Was younger than she'd imagined, perhaps 50, Not yet old, well-dressed in the way of a man who wore good clothes as a tool rather than a pleasure. He had a pleasant face, which she'd learned to distrust more than an unpleasant one, because a pleasant face on a man who did what he did meant he'd had a great deal of practice making the unacceptable seem reasonable. He stood when they came in. He looked at Calder first, then at Eliza, then at Mara, and his assessment was quick and professional and told nothing. "Mr. Boone," he said, "I wasn't expecting you today." "I have the payment," Calder said. Something shifted in Crow's expression, so small and so fast that Eliza would not have caught it if she hadn't been watching for it. Calculation. A door she suspected he'd been planning to walk through closing before he reached it. "Full balance," he said. He said it pleasantly. "Full balance," Calder said. "Principal and interest, per the note." Eliza set the pouch on the banker's desk. The banker, a soft-faced man named Aldridge, who had the look of someone who preferred not to be in the room for conversations like this one, pulled the pouch toward him and began counting without being asked. Crow watched the counting. His pleasant face maintained its pleasantness. She watched him. "It's a hard winter for a ranch this size," he said. Conversationally, the space between Calder and Eliza. "Most operations in the valley have been struggling. Whether the feed costs. Most operations," Calder said. "Yours included, I'd have thought." He glanced at Eliza. "New household to manage, unexpected expenses." "We managed," Eliza said. Looked at her directly for the first time. It had the eyes of someone who was always calculating something. Right now what he was calculating was her age, her bearing, the fact that she'd been the one to set the pouch on the desk. "You're the wife," he said. "I'm the wife," she confirmed. "Arrangement worked out then," he said. He said it as though it were an observation, something neutral. But there was something underneath it that was neither neutral nor particularly pleasant. The particular tone of a man who had expected to find a situation he could exploit and was finding instead a wall. The arrangement, she said, became a marriage. He smiled. It was a good smile which made it worse. "Of course," he said. "I meant no offense." "None taken," she said, in a tone that indicated clearly that some had been noted and filed. Aldridge finished counting. "It's all here," he said. Crow, with the visible relief of a man who had not wanted to be part of whatever alternative outcome had been possible. Crow looked at the money on the desk. He looked at Calder. Looked at Eliza once more, brief and final. "Well," he said, "the note is satisfied." He said it the way you say something you've rehearsed being gracious about and are pulling off adequately. Picked up his hat from the edge of the desk. "The Boone Ranch stands." "Does," Eliza said. Put his hat on and buttoned his coat and nodded once. Generally, Gawain walked out of the bank with the even unhurried pace of a man who had other properties and other plans and was not, ultimately, deterred. She understood that. Agnes had told her as much. This was not defeat for Silas Crow. It was a delay. But delay was enough. Delay was today's victory, and she had learned to take the victory available rather than wait for the one she wished for. She looked at Aldridge, who was completing the receipt with the focused energy of someone who needed something to do with his hands. "We'll need the note marked satisfied," she said, "and a copy of the documentation." "Of course," he said. He produced it in under 3 minutes, which suggested he'd had it ready, which made her feel something between satisfaction and cold anger that she kept off her face. Calder took the receipt. He held it for a moment, looking at it. She watched him hold it, that piece of paper that said, in official language, what $432 and 30 days of hard labor and 26 days of needlework and one neighbor's faith had bought, and she thought about all the things that paper didn't say. Didn't say, a frightened girl signed her name to a document in Georgia because her father needed money. Didn't say, a widowed man with a silent daughter drove to a train station in January and stood on a platform holding his hat. Didn't say, a child touched a quilt and spoke her mother's name for the first time in 2 years. Didn't say any of the things that had actually happened, because official documents never did. Just said the debt was paid, which was true, and was also the least true thing about all of it. Mara, who had been standing very still and very quiet for the entirety of this exchange in the way she did when she understood something serious was happening, and had decided to be small so she could stay in the room, looked up at Calder. "Is it finished?" she asked. "It's finished," he said. Looked at Eliza. "It's finished," Eliza said. Mara absorbed this. Then she said, "Can we get peppermint sticks from the store?" in the tone of someone who felt that serious occasions deserved appropriate commemoration. Calder looked at Eliza. "Yes," Eliza said, "we absolutely can." They got peppermint sticks, and Mara ate hers on the wagon ride home, with the focused appreciation of someone who understood that peppermint was the correct choice and was vindicated by the reality of it. The sky stayed honest and blue overhead, and the mountains were showing the first tentative softening of their snow line, the white creeping upward as the valley below tried out the idea of warmth. Eliza sat on the bench and felt the receipt in her pocket and watched the road go under the wheels and thought about Silas Crow walking out of the bank into his waiting future. Thought about Agnes in her kitchen 40 years ago, opening a door to a house that wasn't hers yet, and about her mother at a kitchen table in Georgia getting smaller and smaller until she disappeared. She thought about the woman she had been on the train coming West 18, frightened, carrying everything she owned in a battered suitcase, trying to build a face that would survive whatever was coming. She had not known then that what was coming was this. She had not known that what was coming was survivable, let alone this. Things she would tell that girl, if she could. Not many, because the girl needed to live through it herself to understand it, but a few. She would tell her, the man on the platform is not your father. He is not any of the men you are afraid of. He is just a man, complicated and closed, and carrying things he hasn't told you yet, and he will surprise you. She would tell her, the child who measures you with her eyes is measuring you because she learned to be careful, not because she will stay closed. She will open. You will open her. You will open each other, and neither of you will see it coming. She would tell her, the house is dark and cold when you arrive. You will make it warm. This is not a small thing. She would tell her, you are going to be short of money for a very long time, and a neighbor you barely know is going to put $100 on your kitchen table and ask for bags she doesn't need. And this will teach you something about women and about the particular solidarity of people who have survived being underestimated. She would tell her, you will be afraid, and you will do the thing anyway, which is the only definition of courage that actually means anything. She couldn't tell the girl any of it, so she sat on the wagon bench in the April sun and ate the last inch of her peppermint stick and let the road carry them home. April moved through the valley with the tentative optimism of a season that had been delayed by a hard winter and was now making up for lost time. Calves came in strong, 8 of them all told, the smallest one the one Eliza had sat with through those 3 cold hours on the night it arrived. She was a compact, stubborn little creature with a disposition toward independence that Mara found deeply relatable and had named Thistle, which Calder had accepted with the equanimity of a man who had decided that calf naming was outside the jurisdiction of his opinions. Thistle grew. They all grew. Kitchen garden Eliza had broken the frozen soil, for came up in May with the particular enthusiasm of seeds that had been waiting for the right conditions, and found them beans and squash and a long row of the hardy root vegetables that kept. Through winter, in a small section she'd reserved for herbs that Mara had helped plant on a Saturday morning, both of them on their knees in the dirt. Mara asking questions about each seed with the serious investment of someone for whom information was its own form of pleasure. The embroidery business did not stop when the foreclosure threat did. It wouldn't have occurred to Eliza to let it stop. Orders kept coming. Agnes' 10 bags were completed and delivered in early May, and Agnes had received them with a nod of approval that carried more weight than most people's effusive praise, and shortly thereafter had mentioned them to a cousin in Helena, and the cousin had written to ask whether Mrs. Boone could supply a set of 12 for a wedding party. She could. She did. She negotiated the price herself in writing, because she had found that writing created a clarity that prevented later disagreements about what had been agreed. Calder watched this development with an expression she had come to recognize something between amusement and the specific pride of a man who is watching someone he loves do something well and is trying not to make the watching too visible, because he understood she didn't do it for an audience. You're going to outgrow this kitchen, he said one evening, watching her sort through a new delivery of thread she'd ordered from the catalog. Not yet, she said. Eventually, she agreed. We'll figure it out. He had started saying that we'll figure it out with a naturalness that told her it was no longer something he was trying to say, but something he actually thought. Distinction mattered to her. It mattered considerably. Ruth came in May with her husband and her 2 boys, officially for a visit and unofficially, Eliza suspected, to see the state of things with her own eyes. She arrived with the same directness she'd shown on her first visit, looked around the ranch and the house and the garden and the calves, And spent an afternoon at the kitchen table, with Eliza going through the order book she'd started keeping, with the focus of a woman who had done some bookkeeping in her time and found this one correctly organized. "You should charge more for the quilts," Ruth said. "I know," Eliza said. "I've been building the customer base first." Ruth looked at her. "When do you raise the price?" "Next month," Eliza said. "June, when the Helena order's finished and delivered and they've had time to like them." Ruth set the book down. "Clara used to say Calder needed someone who could manage things. She meant the ranch." She looked at Eliza. "I think she'd find this amusing." Eliza was quiet for a moment. She always was, when Clara came up, not out of discomfort exactly, but out of respect for the space the woman still occupied in this house and in these people. She did not try to replace that. She never had. She had found, over months, that there was room for all of it: Clara's quilt on Mara's bed, Clara's rose-colored thread in the repaired rings, Clara's opinions about double wedding patterns and the excessive number of rings. Also Eliza's jars on the windowsill, and Eliza's orders in the book, and Eliza's hands in this kitchen making it warm. A house could hold more than one woman's love. She had come to believe that. "I think she'd have had opinions about the pricing," Eliza said. Ruth laughed. It was a real laugh, sudden and unguarded. "She absolutely would have," she said. "She would have told you to charge double and meant it." "I'll get there," Eliza said. It was her birthday that changed things. Or rather, it was what Calder did on her birthday that changed things. And what changed was not their relationship that had been changing for months in increments, too small to point at, until suddenly you looked and couldn't see the starting point anymore, but the name they gave it. She woke on the 3rd of April to find him in the kitchen before her, which was unusual. He was a morning person in the way that outdoor work made people morning people, but she was typically downstairs first. She came into the kitchen and found him at the stove, which was more unusual still. And on the table was a plate of biscuits that were better than the ones Mara had made during the storm, which was a low bar, but they were genuine biscuits and had clearly required effort. Mara was already seated. She was wearing her blue apron with the embroidered rabbit and the expression of someone managing a secret successfully. "Happy birthday," Calder said. His back was to her. "You made biscuits," she said. "I made an attempt at biscuits," he said, turning with the pan. He looked at the biscuits and then at her. "They're better than they look." "They look fine," she said. "They don't," he said. "But they're edible." They were. They ate them with honey and the last of the winter's preserved plum jam, and Mara sang a version of a birthday song she'd learned at school that had several words wrong and didn't appear to know this. The morning was ordinary and warm in all the ways. Mornings had become ordinary and warm in this house. After breakfast, after Mara had been sent to collect eggs with the focused purpose of someone given an important assignment, Calder stayed at the table. He had something in his hand. She noticed it when she was clearing the plates, a small thing, held loosely, the way you hold something you've been carrying for a while and have been waiting for the right moment to put down. Set it on the table. It was a ring. Simple gold, thin, with no stone, the kind of ring a man bought when he had modest means and complete intention. She looked at it. She looked at him. "I know we have a contract," he said. He said it the way he said everything that cost him directly, without decoration, because decoration was a way of managing distance, and he had stopped wanting distance. "I know you signed papers and came here on an arrangement, and none of it was." He stopped. "Tried a different entry point. What I mean is that you didn't choose this. Not at the start. And I want you to be able to choose it. Now. With everything on the table." She sat down. He looked at the ring and then at her. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because of the contract. Not because of what you agreed to when you were 18 and your father needed money. Because you want to. Because this is what you want." She looked at the ring on the table. She thought about the paper she'd signed in Georgia, with her name in ink so dark it looked permanent. She thought about the platform in Billings. Cold, the horse she'd heard but not understood, child who measured her with her eyes. She thought about the cow that died and the quilt and the word mama falling into a room like a stone into still water. She thought about the paper with the columns and the cloth pouch on the kitchen table and the receipt in her pocket that said in official language what $432 had bought. She thought about the man across the table who had put a latch on the inside of her door before she arrived, because he thought it mattered that she felt safe. Who had written down the colors of his wife's quilt like they mattered. Who had sold his horse so she would not be cold. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger. His hands were steady. She had noticed he was steadier when something was important, as though importance settled him rather than shaking him, as though weight was something he moved toward rather than away from. She looked at the ring on her finger for a moment. "Fits," she said. "Ruth told me the size," he said. "Of course she did," Eliza said. He made the sound that lived near laughter. He looked up and found him looking at her with the expression he kept trying to keep private and kept failing to, the one that was too simple and too large at the same time. The one that said, "I did not know you were coming, and I do not know what I would do now if you hadn't." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Outside, they could hear Mara at the chicken coop, having what sounded like a philosophical disagreement with one of the hens about the nature of egg production. Gah! The April sun was coming through the kitchen window at the angle that meant it was mid-morning, the angle that made everything it touched look like the thing it was trying to be. She would think, sometimes, in the years that followed, because there were years that followed, real ones, the ordinary and complicated kind, about what it meant to choose something you hadn't chosen at the beginning. She would think about it when she was sitting at the kitchen table with the order book and the jars of dye and the catalog of thread, which had grown into something genuine by that summer, and something profitable by winter, and something she had taught 2 other women in the valley to do alongside her by the following spring. She would think about it when she was watching Calder come in from the barn at dusk, with the satisfied exhaustion of a man whose land was his, and whose debt was paid, and whose cattle were in. She would think about it when Mara sat beside her in the evenings and talked, which she did constantly, about everything, with the particular velocity of a child who had stored up 2 years of words and was not in any hurry to stop spending them. She would think about it, and she would arrive, each time, at the same place. She had not chosen this, not at first. She had signed a paper because her father needed money, and she had no other option, and she had come west on a train with 1 suitcase and the armor of a woman who had learned to expect the worst and be unsurprised by it. And then, piece by piece, through cold and work and grief and $30 of embroidered bags and 1 neighbor's faith and 1 child's slow-built trust, she had chosen it. Not once grandly, but in small increments, each one a little larger than the last. Fire rebuilt, the quilt repaired, the garden broken out of frozen ground, paper with the columns. "I love you," said in a kitchen, quieter than intended, more real than she'd planned. That was the thing no one told you about choice. It wasn't always one moment. Sometimes it was 100 small ones, accumulating slowly into something you looked back at and recognized as a life. She was not a simple woman. She had not had a simple life, not in Georgia and not in Montana and not in the years between or after. She had been afraid. She had been wrong. She had on more than one occasion said the harder true thing when the softer false thing would have been easier for everyone. She had not always been patient. She had not always been kind. She had been, was still, would always be a person, full-sized and imperfect, and doing the best she could with the materials available, which were sometimes good and sometimes not, and always, in the end, enough. Agnes Whitlock, who came to dinner twice a year and brought wine that was better than the occasion required, and said exactly what she thought about everything, told her, once years later, on a summer evening with the ranch going gold around them, and Mara running through the yard, chasing something she would probably not catch, that the most important decision of a woman's life was almost never the one she thought it was. "You think it was marrying Calder," Agnes said. In the flat way she said things that were more observation than conversation. "Wasn't it?" Eliza said. Agnes looked at her. "The most important decision you made," she said, "was getting off the train." Eliza thought about this. The platform. The cold, her 1 battered suitcase. Boots that were wrong for Montana winter. The child at the bottom of the steps measuring her with ancient eyes. She could have gotten back on the train. The thought had crossed her mind. She would admit that now. For exactly the time it took to understand that there was nowhere to go back to. So she had stepped off the platform and into the cold, and walked toward a stranger and a life she hadn't chosen, and had spent the better part of a year choosing it, piece by piece, until it was hers. She said to Agnes, "I suppose it was." Agnes refilled her wine, and looked out at the yard, where Mara had caught whatever she'd been chasing, a frog it appeared, which she was now showing to her father with the triumphant intensity of a naturalist presenting a significant discovery. Calder was looking at the frog with an expression that was trying very hard to be interested. "Terrible with frogs," Eliza said. "He's terrible with most things that aren't cattle and that girl," Agnes said. "Me," Eliza said. She didn't say it with sentiment, just as a fact, kind of fact that doesn't need dressing up. Agnes looked at her. The measuring look she'd given the first time she came to the door softened at the edges in the way it had slowly softened over the years. Yes, Agnes said. And you, the evening settled around them. Mountains went the color they went in summer evenings, the blue deepening until it was almost purple, and the ranch sat in it the way it had sat in every other evening since someone had first planted a stake in this ground and said, "This is where we stay." Mare's laugh carried across the yard, clear and bright, the laugh of a child who had come back from a very dark place and found that the world had stayed where she left it. Calder's voice followed, lower, saying something about the frog that made her laugh again. Eliza listened to her family making noise in the evening and felt the ring on her finger and the warm weight of a life she had built, out of necessity and stubbornness and love in that order, in overlapping and complicated measure. She had come to Montana with nothing she'd chosen. She was leaving not that evening, not for many years, but eventually, as everyone did with everything she'd built. No one could sell that. No one could foreclose on it or buy the note or put it on a document and call it satisfied. It was not the kind of thing that appeared in columns on a piece of paper, just hers. It had always, in every way that mattered, been hers. She picked up her wine and looked at the mountains going dark and thought, I would get off that train again. Every time, in every winter, I would get off the train and walk into the cold and find my way to this. She didn't say it out loud. Agnes would have found it excessive. She thought it, and she meant it. And, in the long quiet of that summer evening, with the mountains going dark and her daughter laughing in the yard and her husband standing in the last of the light, she let herself have the fullness of it without apology. That was the whole story. Not the paper she'd signed in Georgia, and not the debt paid in April, and not the ring placed on a birthday morning with steady hands. Story was the choosing slow and imperfect and real, the way all the best things were, the way she had come to understand that anything worth having asked you to choose it, not once but constantly, in the ordinary light of ordinary days, for as long as you had the days to spend. She had the days. She intended to spend every one.